In this video, I'm going to show you how to create and edit brushes with the brush editor. Brushes work by drawing a brush shape onto a canvas many times in a row. If there are enough copies and they are close enough, they blend together to create a smooth stroke. If I increase the spacing, it becomes more apparent what's going on. Now let's create our own brush. We'll start by creating a new brush in the library. This will open up the brush editor with a basic circle brush. Each brush in Exothermic contains two graphs. The brush graph evaluates for each copy of the brush. The post-process graph evaluates after all the brush copies have been drawn. We'll talk about the brush graph first. The Render Inputs node controls the spacing between the copies. The Circle Generator node is creating the circular raster image that will be copied onto the canvas, and the Draw node is drawing that raster onto the brush layer. The Brush Outputs node supplies you with many different properties that describe the brushstroke that the user is drawing, the most important of which is the position of the cursor on the canvas. But there are many other parameters as well, such as how long the stroke is, and how much time has elapsed since the stroke was started. If we disconnect the position, the brush will just draw a single point, so let's go ahead and reconnect that. The Brush Parameters node feeds in the data that is exposed to the user for easy tweaking of values. Now let's view the post-process graph. This is a very simple graph. The Draw brush layer supplies all the data that was created in the brush graph, and it feeds it into the End Post-Process node, which draws the final brush onto the canvas. Let me show you why the post-process graph is useful. Let's come back over to the brush graph. Say we want to add some noise to the edge of the brush. We can do that with a Noise node, which is in the Brush Distort menu. The problem is, we're just adding noise to the brush tip, which can be useful, but isn't what I was going for. Now if we delete the Noise node from the brush graph, and instead put it in the post-process graph, after all the brush copies have been drawn, we get our desired effect. Most of the nodes of your brush will exist in the brush graph, but there are times when it will be useful to come over here to the post-process graph. Now let's see how by just playing with the position, we can create a unique brush. First, we'll use the Points to Numbers node to get the individual values for X and Y. And then we'll add the Numbers to Point node to recombine the numbers back into a point value. If we run the X value through a round number node, we can create a cool effect. Adjust the round to target parameter to quantize the X position. Pretty neat. If we do the same thing to the Y value, we can draw on a grid. If we set the targets to the same size as the brush, it creates a nice tiling effect. That's a cool brush, but what happens if we change the width? It breaks the effect we are going for. So what we can do is we can expose the round to target parameters on each of these nodes, and then plug them into the brush width. Now when we change the width of the brush, everything updates. That's a more useful and more user-friendly brush. We'll accept that brush and start a new one. For this brush, we will play around with color. From the Root Color menu, drag a Sample Gradient node into your brush graph. This node allows us to pick a color from a gradient. Plug the color output of the sample gradient node into the color input on the circle generator. The brush changes color, but it's still a solid color. That's because every copy of the brush is being sampled from the same position on the gradient. Connect the sample gradient's location parameter to the brush output's length % parameter. That's better. Now, no matter how long we draw the stroke, the gradient will stretch along its entire length. Be aware that using the length percentage parameter will slow down the interactivity of drawing with the brush, because every time the cursor moves, the entire brush stroke has to be redrawn. Now let's randomize which color is selected from the gradient. From the Math menu, drag a random number node into the brush graph. Connect the output of the random number to the location on the sample gradient node. There are two index numbers we can use for our seed value. Start with the stroke index. Connect the stroke index on the brush outputs node to the seed input on the random number node. The stroke index supplies a different number each time a stroke is drawn. Now, each time we draw a stroke, a different color is picked from the gradient. That's kind of cool. Now, try the index value instead of the stroke index. The index value supplies a different number each time a copy is generated. Now we're getting lots of variations in color. What if we want to make the colors change a little more gradually? Delete the random number node and drag on a parameter noise 2D node from the Math menu. Plug the sample location into the position property of the brush outputs node. Now plug the output parameter into the location parameter on the sample gradient. That gives us what we are looking for. You can adjust the frequency to change how quickly the values transition. Finally, for this brush, let's expose the gradient to the user so that it can easily be changed. Click on the gear icon to open the brush settings. We don't need the color parameter anymore, so let's remove that. And now let's add a gradient parameter. Now select the new parameter and rename it. Then close the window. We can see that the parameter has been added to the toolbar at the top. We can now expose it on the brush parameters node. And lastly, we will connect it to the sample gradient node. Excellent. Now the user can change the gradient without having to open the brush editor. For our last brush, we will create one based off of a raster image. First, let's create the raster that we will use as the brush. Create a new scene. I'm going to choose the texture preset of 512 by 512. Make sure the background is transparent. I'm going to select the rectangle tool and set it to center mode. I'm also going to turn on viewport snapping. Now I'll create a rectangle in the center of the scene. With the rectangle selected, go to the vector menu, open the modify submenu and select vector clone. Change from the grid mode to circle. Play with the parameters until you get something you like. Now that we've got an image we like, let's create a new brush. Delete the circle generator node and drag on a raster generator node from the brush generate menu. Wire everything back up. Now let's load in the raster. Select the raster parameter to open the raster loading window. Choose library, since that's where our brush image resides. Then select the raster we made earlier. Click finish. Let's increase the brush width to see it better. By default, the raster generator node will just use the alpha channel of the image we supplied it with. But if we turn off the tint parameter, then the color values of the image are used as well. That's pretty cool. We've created a unique brush with just a couple nodes. That gives you just a taste of what is possible with the brush editor in Exothermic. Have fun creating.